So the question is, for me, how do we get out or avoid the extremes of a principled apolitical apathy or full partisan political involvement? So I grew up in a largely principled apolitical home, although I had a little more justification because my parents were British and we emigrated here, so they couldn't vote. So what was the point of paying attention to politics anyway? That didn't change for me until I graduated from law school, but it seemed to go with our kind of Adventist neutrality about politics, and there was no encouragement at church or at school to think about political issues or certainly not be involved with them. Being political was bad. And the few Adventists that thought that this wasn't quite right seemed to go to the other extreme, right? If complete disengagement from politics was not correct, was too far a removal from the world, then it seemed they kind of dropped any barriers against political involvement. And of course, I had Adventist friends who were known for their commitment to being Democrats or Republicans, right? And would essentially become indistinguishable from the party loyalty that they chose. So, we seem to oscillate between these two extremes. And even to this day, I have a little bit of difficulty. I was in the middle, this contentious election, and in my neighborhood, I have a next door neighbor, charming elderly couple, completely devoted to Trump and Fox News. And very early on, they put up a Trump 2020 sign. And across the street, I have some more liberal neighbors, and they began putting up Biden, Harris signs, and then some more signs to support their Senate candidates. And then my next door neighbor adds to his Trump sign a flag. He has an American flag, and so he gets a big Trump Make America Great Again flag, puts it just underneath the American flag. And then I was like, okay, here I am, a guy with a degree in Adventist theology and a law degree, an American history degree, and I have nothing to say in the middle of this frenzied, enthusiastic political environment about the direction my country should take. So I took it as a little bit of a challenge. What can I say that's consistent with Adventist principles of political engagement, right? I should know something about that at this point, and it should allow me to say something. And so I made an effort, and many of you have seen it perhaps. I posted it on Facebook. Let me see if I can go to full screen here. And so here it is. Are you seeing multiple slides on your screen?
Yes.
Okay, let me do that. View slideshow. Okay, how's that? You see one slide? Okay. So here's where I ended up, and I don't think it's perfect, and we can discuss this in the discussing section. But I found a Jesus 2020 poster, right? I want people to clearly know I'm going to be voting in good part based on Christian biblical principles. But that's not enough, because any one of these signs, if I put them up on their own, is going to send a completely different message than all three signs together, right? If I just put up the Jesus 2020 sign with the red and the blue, people will think I'm probably supporting my Trump neighbor next door. And so I need to put something that indicates that I care about some minority rights and fairness in my community. And so I put up the Black Lives Matter sign. But if I just put up that sign, then people will think I'm a left-wing Christian, and this is just the endorsement that I'm making. And so I get this Blue Lives Matter sign. And I feel like I can legitimately put this up because I used to, in my private, not private practice, but I worked for the government for a number of years, right near where Jason is sitting. And one of my roles was defending police officers in court. And so I got to know them as colleagues and friends, drove around with them in their police cars and defended them in court. And I have a respect for what they do every day, putting on a uniform that makes them in some ways a target in our community, that they will put their lives on the line to protect our community, those that are acting justly and fairly, and most of them do. So with these three signs together, right, I don't know if my neighbors just say, wow, he's really confused, or a powerful message of how a Christian can think about these matters comes out, and I'm sharing it with my community. So we can talk about that and how to make it more effective or what can be done differently. It hasn't led to any powerful, amazing conversations with my neighbors yet, but who knows? But what I wanted to do was to share with you the kind of principles that I drew on to help guide this particular communication, as well as my other engagements politically and morally in my community. And I'm going to start by summarizing where I end. I've come up with 7 good Seventh-day Adventist numbers, 7 principles of SDA voting and political involvement. And I'll just walk through them very quickly here, and then we'll go in greater depth with each one to explain where it comes from. So I think the first one is that the church's primary role will be about the gospel and conversion, right? We can't move away from that. We're not a social gospel church, but true gospel and conversion applied will result in Christians working for social change and fairness. 2, that we are for law and order. We will obey and respect the government when it is just and does what it should in the role that God has given it. But when it is unjust, that we have a heritage and a tradition with roots in the Bible and through the Protestant history of nonviolent civil disobedience and protest. And our pioneers engaged in that. 3, that we can vote, and when we do vote, we should vote for justice, humanity, and right, but we can't vote for those that oppose virtue, the rule of law, and support slavery and racism. And this isn't just Nick Miller's opinion. I'm going to share with you a general conference resolution from the 19th century that sets this out. 4, we're not supposed to link up with political parties, voting, supporting, and publicly promoting them. And when I say voting, I mean you can't just vote a party line ticket, right? 5, though, that some moral issues are so connected with gospel principles of the image of God, including freedom, equality, or health, that they deserve our support in the political sphere, whether voting as an issue or as a candidate. 6, that we should be open to God's call to government service, especially when we can do so in a nonpartisan manner. And then finally, the render unto Caesar the same things that are Caesar's. Christ was not a citizen of the government that he was in, right? Ellen White says he's our example in all things, and of course that's true. But how would he have behaved when he was a citizen in a republic, right? His duties as a citizen would have been somewhat different. So he himself said, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. And we need to have a clear sense of what that is in our day. So let me get through these, and so we have some time for discussion. I want to begin by what is probably the guiding and leading quote for white middle-class Adventism for the last 50 to 75 years. And you're probably all familiar with it. I won't need to cite the whole thing. I have it on the screen, but it's the one about Jesus living under a corrupt and oppressive government. There's extortion, intolerance, grinding cruelty, yet the Savior attempted no civil reforms. He attacks no national abuses, nor condemned the national enemies. He did not interfere with the authority or administration of those in power. He was our example, kept aloof from earthly government. So this is a very strong quote. And if you have the other principles that I just set out in your head, it sort of highlights the danger of taking any single Ellen White quote and making that your guidance, your total guidance in any particular field, right? You have to look at what else she says and how else she practices. And she goes on, it wasn't that he was indifferent to the woes of men, because the remedy did not lie in merely human and external measures. Sometimes we gloss over that word merely, right? As though it says the remedy did not lie in human and external measures. No, she says merely. So clearly human and external measures may have some impact, but it has to go beyond that. Not by the decisions of courts or councils, but by the implanting of Christ's nature and humanity through the work of the Holy Spirit. So you can't read that, though, and not recognize what the church's primary role needs to be, right? We can never give up or move away from the importance of the conversion of the human heart and the church's central role in preaching and teaching that message. But most Adventists, white middle-class Adventists, overlook the context of this quote, and the context is important. She wasn't just talking about Christian political impact or involvement generally. She was talking to a particular movement of her day. Just a couple of paragraphs earlier is this: today in the religious world, there are multitudes who, as they believe, are working for the establishment of the kingdom of Christ as an earthly and temporal dominion. They desire to make our Lord the ruler of the kingdoms of this world, the ruler in its courts and camps, its legislative halls, its palaces and marketplaces. They expect him to rule through legal enactments enforced by human authority. And the next line says that this was the view that the Jews had of the Messiah, right? So she's talking about a theocratic outlook, right, of Christians who want to take the Bible and the church and then use politics to impose the rule of the church on society. And then she goes into the whole thing about how Christ kept aloof from earthly governments, right? He, in his role as spiritual leader of the church, stayed out of trying to use politics to further the spiritual teaching and message of the church. So, it doesn't mean that the church isn't supposed to, it doesn't take away from the message that the church is supposed to focus on spiritual things, but it doesn't exhaust a discussion of the responsibilities that the Christian citizen might have, right? And we see this when we look, if you just absolutize this quote, then Christians shouldn't vote, shouldn't be involved in issues of any kind. But we can see that the early Adventists did not believe this. That at least they believed in opposing unfair and unjust government, and had from the very early days an embrace of civil disobedience. Now, many Adventists today are a bit nervous about this. We have a good contingent in our midst who are attracted to the philosophy of law and order, right? Law and order, obeying the state and its law is good. We're commandment keepers after all, and obeying the law is what we're supposed to do. And Ellen White says this in support of that: let Seventh-day Adventists do nothing that will mark them as lawless and disobedient. Evangelism 173. So it's good to be in support of law and order. We're opposed to anarchy, to having no state, but just as strong in the Adventist tradition is the impulse or the belief of disobeying unjust laws. And again, you can't, Ellen White's absolutist statements can be misleading. Let Seventh-day Adventists do nothing that will mark them as lawless and disobedient. Except when you look at other quotes here at Patriarchs and Prophets, when King David commanded that which was contrary to God's law, it became a sin to obey, right? When is it a sin to obey? It can be a sin to obey the laws of your nation when those laws further or promote injustice and inequality. Most obviously, we have the teaching about Sunday and Sabbath observance. We've always, at the core of Adventist eschatology is a belief that it will become a moral duty towards God to disobey earthly governments, right? So our law and order sense has always had limitations, but for many conservative Adventists, those limitations are only about Sunday and Sabbath laws, right? The government is to be obeyed, although someday it will try to change the day of worship. But shouldn't the reality and the fact of civil disobedience on Sunday and Sabbath issues open our mind to the possibility and, in fact, the reality of the need to disobey other unjust laws and other unfair laws? Certainly our pioneers understood that, and Ellen White had a very strong statement about that in relation to the fugitive slave law. This was before the Civil War. The law of our land requiring us to deliver a slave to his master, we are not to obey, right? She was very open and even defiant in her assertion that we had a moral, God-given duty to disobey the federal law about the fugitive slaves. Several Adventist leaders participated in the Underground Railroad to help escape slaves, including John Byington, our first General Conference president. When you start disobeying one law, there's other laws that get disobeyed along the way, right? It's hard to run a stop on the Underground Railway with probably violating a whole host of other civic zoning laws and, how you could use your house. And so Seventh-day Adventists become lawbreakers when the law is violative of basic moral teachings of the Bible and the natural law. So, but very quickly, they moved beyond just disobeying unjust laws to saying we had to do something to help make society systemically a better place. And here's the General Conference quote that I found so interesting. It was quite early in our history, right? This is 1865. It's only 2 years after we've formally organized as a denomination. And even at a later stage, people are wondering, oh, should we vote or not? But here's this resolution, 1865, resolved that in our judgment, the act of voting, when exercised in behalf of justice, humanity, and right, is in itself blameless, and may at sometimes be highly proper. But that casting of any vote that shall strengthen the cause of such crimes as intemperance, insurrection, and slavery, we regard as highly criminal in the sight of heaven. But we would deprecate any participation in the spirit of party strife. It was interesting. James White said later on, after, well, it may have been prior to this, but after the vote that brought Abraham Lincoln to the presidency, that Adventists voted, and the ones that voted to a man, and remember, women couldn't vote at that time, voted for Abraham Lincoln. Now, I don't know how he knew that, right? But clearly there was a sense in the church that this was the proper vote for anyone who was a committed Adventist. So what I found most interesting about this statement, probably if we said something like this today, we would say, that the right to vote is a right of citizenship that we should exercise carefully in prayer and Bible study, but it's up to the individual as to how they're convicted. But this goes a little beyond that, doesn't it? It says not only that we can vote, it doesn't say we must vote. And I think that's significant, right? That the act of voting can happen, and at sometimes it's highly proper, which seems to suggest sometimes you really should vote. But it sets down some guidance about how you should vote, doesn't it? It just doesn't leave it up to you. It says we should vote on behalf of justice, humanity, and right, right? What is that? It would be interesting to try to tease out what they mean there, and maybe in our discussion time we can do some of that. But the casting of any vote, but then also how you shouldn't vote, that you can't vote for somebody who's going to commit crimes as intemperance, insurrection, which can be a breakdown of law and order or really a violation of the rule of law, and slavery. And really, what's a badge of slavery if not racism? But then the closing line is something that perhaps has overcome anything else that was said in this quote. We would deprecate any participation in the spirit of party strife. So early on, they said no involvement in partisan politics, whatever that means and however we define it. Ellen White said something like this. Again, we say we leave it up to the individual conscience how to vote, and how can you do anything but that? But she also says, we can't vote for political parties in like a straight line vote, right? We're just voting not the person, but just choosing the party platform and voting for that party. We cannot labor to please men who will use their influence to repress religious liberty. This becomes her central concern in government and voting. The people of God are not to vote to place such men in office. For when they do this, they are partakers with them of the sins which they commit while in office. Now, that's a pretty strong quote. And I've had some people say, well, we shouldn't vote at all because if we vote for someone and then they commit something wrong in office, that's charged to us. I don't read this statement as saying that. The way I read this, if people that are running for office express positions that are violative of religious freedom, for instance, and then knowing that they've expressed those positions, we choose to vote for them, and then they do those things while they're in office, well, then we will be responsible for that, right? We're not responsible for leaders that go bad or go wrong or do things they said they wouldn't do. But if they express things that are wrong, that violate religious liberty, or in my view, other basic moral truths about natural rights, and then we put them in office, and then they follow through and do those things and abuse people and commit wrong, then you become culpable, right? And this itself becomes an argument for maybe sometimes not voting at all, right? If both leaders are saying they're going to do things which you view as centrally morally wrong, then a principled abstention, I think, is not inappropriate. So, but we should vote when we can do so in defense of certain moral principles. And there's a quote from Ellen White: "Men of intemperance have been in the office today in a flattering manner, expressing their approbation or support or encouragement of the course of the Sabbath keepers in not voting, and express hopes that they will stick to their course, and like the Quakers, not cast their vote." Right? The Quakers are famous pacifists who are non-politically involved. "Satan and his evil angels are busy at this time, and he has workers upon the earth. May Satan be disappointed is my prayer." Right? So you can disappoint Satan by voting for the proper moral cause. At least that's what Ellen White says. Now, we do need to reflect on this linking up with political parties, because I think this is important. We're making a case for some kind of political involvement, but we need to be clear where those lines need to be drawn as far as where involvement becomes over-involvement. And so we need to reflect on a couple of quotes where she talks about this danger. "There is a danger, decided danger, for all who shall link themselves up with political parties of the world. There is fraud on both sides. God has not laid upon any of our people the burden of linking up with either party." Now, this is rather a stark and strong quote. There are some other ones that appear to be directed towards pastors and Bible teachers, as though there's kind of a special limitation on them. But this one seems to be addressed to everybody, right? There's fraud on both sides, not laid on any of our people. That seems to be a pretty broad quote that would include not just teachers and preachers, but laity. And here's the special one about those who teach the Bible in our churches and in our schools are not at liberty to unite in making apparent their prejudices for or against political men or measures, because by so doing they stir up the minds of others, leading each to advocate his favorite theory. The Lord would have his people bury political questions. So again, this is a quote along with the Desire of Ages quote that has often been used to say, look, we just can't talk about anything that we're voting on, whether it be a person or an initiative. But then we have to look at how she herself understood and applied this counsel. And she did this quite dramatically and centrally in talking about the issue of temperance and temperance reform. So here again, she says, she requotes what she said earlier: "While we are in no wise to become involved in political questions, yet it is our privilege to take our stand decidedly on all questions relating to temperance reform." So you see this distinction. There's political questions, and then there's temperance reform. Well, was temperance reform a political question? Well, it was at some level, in that it was on the ballot, and it was being discussed, and it was being run by one party or the other. But you can see that when she says political question, she doesn't mean anything that's being voted on. She seems to mean a question that's purely of political policy. And at the time when she was being critical of Adventist involvement in political questions, it was about the monetary reform. Should we be on the gold standard or the silver standard, or have a fiat currency? And this had implications for economic matters in society, but she believed that it was too far removed from any moral question of the gospel, that it was becoming a diversion. But when it came to prohibition and alcohol, that was sufficiently close to a question of the gospel and of moral living that she felt very differently about it. Concerning this, I have often borne a plain testimony. There is a cause, she said, I wrote, for the moral paralysis upon our society. Laws sustain an evil which is sapping their very foundations. Many deplore the wrongs which they know exist, but consider themselves free from all responsibility. This cannot be. Many deplore the wrongs. Okay, every individual exerts an influence in society. In our favored land, every voter has some voice in determining what laws shall control the nation. Should not that influence and that vote be cast on the side of temperance and virtue? The advocates of temperance fail to do their whole duty unless they exert their influence by precept and example, by voice and pen and vote. We ourselves must grapple with this foe. Now that's very interesting, because for all that I've shared with you thus far, you might come with a sense that, well, okay, we should quietly go into the voting booth and then cast our vote for what we think is the most moral and virtuous candidate, or on the side of that issue. But we should keep our vote to ourselves, right? You've probably heard this before. And I think it's wise at times to keep who you voted for to yourself. But she says here that we haven't done our whole duty when it comes to truly central moral issues if we have not advocated by voice and pen and vote, right? This suggests not just voting, but writing and speaking broadly on the issue, being an advocate, something that some people would call a political advocate. But if the issue is important and central enough to morality and the gospel, then it is apparently, from what's being said here, open to our advocacy and involvement. So, what about actually being involved in politics itself? And this quote here is from Messages to Young People, and talks about, this is actually one of the quotes that helped cause me to aim to go to law school, in a world where most Adventists either went into healthcare work or medicine, teaching. But she said this: "Dear youth, what is the aim and purpose of your life? Are you ambitious for education, that you may have a name and position in the world? Have you thoughts that you dare not express, that you may one day stand upon the summit of intellectual greatness, that you may sit in deliberative and legislative councils and help to enact laws for the nation?" And as an Adventist young person, I expected the next part of this quote to say, you know, put these earthly ambitions behind you, seek that which is eternal and enduring, and, you know, become a preacher of the gospel. But no, in a great surprise, she says, there is nothing wrong in these aspirations. You may, every one of you, make your mark. You should be content with no mean attainment. Aim high and spare no pains to reach the high standard. And she goes on talking about, balanced by religious principle, you can ascend to these great heights. So, you know, this language here, sit in deliberative and legislative councils and help to elect laws for the nation. So when I was a young man in my 20s, late 20s, I felt like I partially fulfilled this, quote. I was involved in a First Amendment advocacy organization and helped lobby for the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Person Act that some of you are familiar with. And I actually went and was involved in, they do Senate testimony sessions. And I gave some testimony to in Senate councils about the impact of the bill and the importance of it. So I sat there and I helped enact the law, and I had the privilege of, when it was signed, I was one of the supporters of it. I was invited to the Oval Office, and when President Clinton signed it, and have a picture there, and, you know, sort of one of the high days of my career. And so, you know, this quote that I followed sort of became true in some sense for me personally. But I have to say that I think that the language she uses here would suggest that actually young Christian people could sit as part of these legislative councils, right? It's not just I appeared before them, but to sit in deliberative and legislative councils and to help enact laws for the nation, to me, suggests a more fundamental kind of involvement in it. Now, how this happens without being involved in the partisan political process leading up to it, I don't know. But I'm unwilling to say that any involvement in legislative politics is just wrong out of the gate. This quote would seem to suggest something else. But I do think you need to take the other principles seriously that have been set out. And I have to say that, and maybe I'm being a little unfair here, but I've experienced it firsthand, so I think I can say it fairly. There have been some Adventists that sit on Capitol Hill in the Congress, but in the instances where I've met those individuals, they are not necessarily good reflections of the earlier principles that I've talked about, but whether it be on the left or the right, are known as being some of the most partisan and deeply committed to the principles of their party. And they're not like, like if John McCain had been an Adventist, I would have been like, oh yeah, like, a Republican, but known as a moderate and a centrist, kind of a peace builder. But unfortunately, Adventists have not done that well. And I think it's our fault in that we've put out this position of, well, Adventists just can't be involved in politics. So the Adventists that you get going into it are perhaps not very deeply good in their Adventism, and so are more expressive of their political positions. Whereas if we had a more balanced teaching on this, maybe we could raise a generation of Adventists who were more moderate and peacemakers. And so it could be our fault in the way we've gone about this. Anyway, biblical examples of involvement in politics. Abraham himself was a civil leader and military commander. Joseph, prime minister of Egypt. Moses was a prince, a judge, and a military commander before he left Egypt. Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah all have high posts in the Babylonian or Persian courts. Centurions become Christians in the New Testament, some in the household of Caesar. There's no written command that we have that these Christians who hold public office should now leave that office, right? Neither John the Baptist nor Christ nor the apostles say this. And in our modern age, most Adventists have stayed away from this. But in other countries like Jamaica, Papua New Guinea, something like 7 of the 9 Supreme Court justices in Papua New Guinea are either Adventists or products of Seventh-day Adventist schools. The prime minister and the president there, I believe, are Adventists at this point. Now, it's not always, we haven't always taught our principles well. The latest I'd heard in Papua New Guinea, the Adventist leaders were trying to get New Guinea declared as a Christian nation in some formal sense. So it's like we have to do some spade work with our own people sometimes to more effectively understand how Christians should work in politics. Several African countries have had high-ranking Adventist leaders of in various offices, including the presidency. Adventist education is so broad and widespread around the world in places that lack education, that those who go through our schools immediately become leaders in their communities and sometimes even at the national level. And I think it suggests that we need to more adequately understand and express our own political principles, because we're creating leaders for the world at times. And I would say we've expressed an inadequate set of principles regarding public involvement, and that doesn't always lead to the best outcome. So I had where did my 7th principle go? Well, I don't have a separate slide for that, but I think that again, the point about Christ had rendered to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. He was a subject of the Roman Empire, right? His sole role, more or less, was obeying laws and paying taxes. But it's very different for a citizen in a republic. In a republic, the people are the government. The government is subject to the people. So your political role is just from the start far more robust and enhanced the things that you owe to Caesar. God has now designated you as a minister because you are part of the government, as a person overseeing the government. So it's not just paying taxes, but it's voting, jury duty, and knowing and advocating public issues that relate to having a just and fair society. And I'll do a shout out at the end here to notions of moral philosophy and natural law. We have to come into the public arena not just with our Bible, or not primarily with our Bible. The Bible can give us guidance, perhaps, as to how moral philosophy and natural law can help us articulate these things. But in a country that believes in the separation of church and state, we have to reinvigorate our concept that there is a natural morality that we can engage with that helps shape and influence our public policy. So all Adventists should be students to some degree of moral philosophy and natural law, or else we really can't intelligently involve ourselves in the public square. So that's kind of the end of the formal presentation. I do have some questions here. What might it mean to vote for justice, humanity, and right today based on the General Conference resolution? What does it look like to vote for crimes such as intemperance, insurrection, and slavery today? What is the modern application of that? And then a final question, and maybe you could start with this one because it's maybe a more well-defined one. Must a Christian always vote for every position or office in every election? Or can there be such a thing as a principled abstention? We hear voices, if you don't vote, then you're just voting for the winner effectively, right? You're throwing your vote away. You have a moral duty to vote. Is that the case? I'm sure there's some discussion that could be had there. And questions on anything else that I've presented. So, Anthony.